So can the other storied characters make up for the failings of our first two? Let's find out. This is probably the strongest part of the movie. I really like the way that these kids are portrayed. Augustus and Veruca are pretty much the same as they are in the book, but it's Violet and Mike that really stand out. Instead of just being somebody who chews gum a lot, Violet Beauregard is that one girl who has to be the best at absolutely everything.
That's a record.
You know the one I'm talking about. She keeps talking about how she's a winner and will do anything to get that prize, even if it means shoving somebody else out of her way. Mike TV has also changed a bit. They focus more on how Mike has become desensitized to the world around him, how he can't see past what's right in front of him, and how he thinks he's smarter than everybody else because of how technologically savvy he is. All of this makes him a perfect contrast to the imaginative Wonka and his often nonsensical chocolate factory. An interesting note, you'll recall that in our last review of this story, we mentioned that Veruca was easily the most bratty of the kids, even getting her own song, and how Violet was just a little bit too likable to be one of the bad kids. In this film, it's actually the reverse. Violet is the brat, and Veruca, while clearly being spoiled rotten, is still fairly likable. At least more so than the other kids. Another change from the 1971 film is that all four of Charlie's grandparents have personalities again, which are actually more distinct than they are in the book. Particularly Grandpa George, who's the stubborn old curmudgeon with the heart of gold, and who often shows more personality than even Grandpa Joe. In general, Charlie's family is more interesting in this movie than they are in the book. Similarly, the parents of all the kids have distinct personalities again, especially Violet's mother, who is that mother.
Mostly baton.
Again, you know the one I'm talking about. And the Oompa Loompas are pretty fun to watch, especially considering they're all the same guy. If anything saved this film, it was the fantastic portrayals of these other characters. But what about Tim Burton's wild images against Roald Dahl's boundless imagination? Now, I said in the Willy Wonka review that the imagery from the 1971 movie, though creative and innovative in its own way, couldn't compete with the imagination of Roald Dahl simply because it was limited by the technology of the time. But, can the same be said for the 2005 movie? Well, the imagery is clearly very creative. Tim Burton has a real gift for visual storytelling, and it really comes through in this movie. I love the way that he depicts aspects of our everyday world, making everything look so exaggerated and yet so familiar at the same time, much like Roald Dahl himself did. And because they're not limited by the technology like they were in 1971, they're able to show us a lot more, like the Chocolate Castle, or Loopaland, or any of the many wonders of Wonka's factory. But this is actually where I have one of my problems with the movie. The first half, in the real world, is very creatively shot and visually interesting, but once we get inside the factory, almost everything is done with computers. And that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of creativity behind it, but to be honest, after 5 years, the images are starting to look a little fake. Unlike the 71 movie, where pretty much everything was functional, I have a real hard time believing that what they're looking at is really there. And I know it's supposed to be a factory of imagination, but the whole point is that it exceeds imagination and yet is still reality, and I really don't get that feeling watching this movie. But probably my main problem with the imagery is just how dark and ominous everything is. I love Danny Elfman's music, but the score becomes just plain creepy at times without any real reason for it. And of course, Burton's direction tends to be pretty dark anyway, so the factory often seems more threatening than anything else. I feel like I'm in a horror flick half the time. Depp's portrayal of Wonka doesn't help. The overall tone of the movie is just never made clear. It's a whimsical children's story, but it has such dark overtones that I'm honestly not sure how I should feel about what I'm seeing. It's almost like they were trying to be as unlike the 1971 film as they possibly could, and that's not the way to go about telling a story. Despite the creativity of the imagery, the book is still the only one to really nail what the tone of this story should be.